Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, Ep.4.
Episode 4! Who'd have thought that?
I'm Johnny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're talking about the missions you find in the main rulebook, Bolt Action 2nd edition. There's 12 of them. We're going to talk about the tactics we'd use, or tactics we have used successfully and unsuccessfully, and some general hints and tips as you go through. So, Phil, do you want to talk about the types of mission you might find in the rulebook to start us off?
Yep, sure, Johnny. So broadly speaking, they're going to fall into three types of missions. So you've got those which are based on kill points, obviously where the winner is the one who's killed more units than the opponent. You've got those that are based on objectives, either securing a particular objective or grabbing something and moving it somewhere else. And then the third type is some form of movement, either moving into a particular part of the board or moving off the table, again, depending on the mission.
I think we should probably, before we go in, because we've got these three types of missions, it would be quite good to give sort of a broad strokes overview of the types of strategies that we think would work for each.
Sure.
So I'll jump in with kill points.
Yep.
Generally, when I'm playing kill points, what I try to do is put as much of my force against as little of your force as possible. Because then what that allows me to do is make sure I finish your unit off to get the order dice.
Yep.
And also, if you then start bullying one of my squads, it allows me to use my other squads to cover the squad that's at risk of being lost.
Yep.
And so what I'm trying to do is bait you into spreading your army as wide as possible, while simultaneously keeping mine as narrow as possible. But of course, that's hard to do, because as soon as I start narrow deploying, you realise what I'm up to. And so I have to sort of throw you by throwing things on random flanks sometimes. And I might lose that one dice, but if it means you spread your army really wide, it can be a really successful strategy. What about you, Phil? How do you play kill points?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. Like you said, it's about focusing, the majority of your force or more of your force on a smaller number of your opponent's force. Deployment, is going to come into it, because obviously if you've got things like a first wave mission where you're bringing your units onto the board rather than pre-deploying them, you're reacting to what's going on in front of you. Whereas in some ways, if you're, for example, like No Man's Land, where you're deploying out of the bag before turn one, there's various things you can do there to try and, dupe your opponent into moving to one part of the board and so on. But yeah, generally speaking, you're trying to put, more of your army or more of your force against a few of the enemy, a few of the opponent. Start chucking in outflanking maneuvers and so on, and you can really mix it up.
Yeah. Objectives? How would you play your objectives missions?
So it does depend on what army I've got. So if I'm playing, veteran stubborn army, for example, I may well be tempted to try and grab those objectives early on.
Yep.
Especially if those objectives are in cover, hard cover, rough ground, ruins, that sort of thing. Because if I can get there first, I can spend, turn 3, 4, 5, 6, arguably going down, and just hope I can weather the storm. On the flip side, if maybe I've got, slightly lighter infantry, but maybe more of them, what I might be looking to do is to jump onto those objectives turn 5, turn 6, or maybe run a unit on towards, the end of turn 5, turn 6 to maybe contest an objective. So it does depend in many ways on what army I've taken and what forces I've chosen.
Yeah, I'm bad at that second one where the late game jump on. I find it very hard to position stuff in the right placed for that last turn grab, because it always gets pinned down or something daft happens where it's slightly too far away because I slightly misjudged it. So what I tend to do, because I tend to play quite fast armies, so what I tend to try to do is just overrun the objectives. And so I tend to just push well past them if possible, and then use something like an officer to hold it behind the lines. So you're fighting my unit, I don't know, my engineers, which are just outside your deployment zone, and actually my officer's another 12 inches back from that, sat on the objective going down as a small team.
Yeah. Movement
missions? What do you think of movement missions? Any big battle plans there?
Move my units around. So I guess the thing with the movement missions, if you're thinking about things like sectors and double envelopment, it's the timing of it, isn't it? It's at what point do you make your move? We'll talk about it in more detail, but you can go early, and you can kind of have that early, get turn 2, turn 3 rush. But if you miscalculate it, or if you've got slightly weaker units, whether or not they're still going to be where they need to be turn 5, turn 6 is another thing entirely. On the flip side, if you leave it too late, particularly if you've got reserves and outflank and that kind of thing, you can end up with them not arriving in time in order to score the points that you need or get them into the positions that you need. So it is a bit of a balancing act. I think, similar to how I was talking about objectives, does kind of depend on what units you're taking.
Absolutely.
Their experience level in terms of, coming onto the board. And also if you've got, stuff in transport and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I'll try and not go too soon.
Yeah.
Although it can be quite fun, to be fair, playing in Dublin Development where you just push everything forward and see what's left.
Well, that's how I play, because there is, and also with the objectives, there is a school of thought where you could just play it as kill points, and then if you win the kill points game, you're the only one with units left at the end to score the victory points. But that's not how I play movement. I play it in the way you've just described, where, because I run a lot of transports and I like fast armies, I'll tend to deploy my chaff and then the stuff that's moving, because usually you have to reserve half your army. That'll all be my trucks and the stuff like that, and I'll just convoy up the board. Because the gamble is that I can exploit a gap where I might lose a truck or two, but if I've got the dice advantage as well, if I get 10 dice into that 3-point zone, that's 30 points before we even start tallying up kills and things. And so I'm very much playing, I'm not even engaging in the battle sometimes, I'm just running around, basically. Now, so there's our 3 types of missions we might find. In terms of setup, we did mention some setup there. Do you want to lead us through the types of setup you might find?
Yeah, so the 2 most common ones are either going to be first wave, where nothing's set up on the board except for maybe forward deployers, and things are coming on turn 1 as you draw the dice out the bag. Or that you're going to pre-deploy with the dice out the bag method. There is one which is everything is in reserve, which is top secret. Which is slightly different.
It's basically just first wave, but you have to take an order test for everything to come on the board.
That's right.
And it's, I don't like that particular setup because it really punishes inexperienced armies. So if you've taken like an Operation Torch army because it's super thematic, you're now almost guaranteed to lose the game because half your army's not going to turn up.
Yeah, because you're rolling on an 8 down to you're rolling on an 8 because it's a US list, isn't it? But
Oh, so actually, not as bad. I'm sure I could have thought of a better example. So there's our 3 types setup. My favourite is the first wave because you get, especially if you're at a tournament, because you get to the table, you decide your table sides, and you basically start the game, and you can start playing immediately. Dice in the bag is okay. It feels a bit admin-y because we decide our reserves, and then you say, I'm going to do this many forward deploys, and I say I'm going to do this many, and then we work out exactly how many dice go in the bag, and then we pull them one at a time, and we have a little think about where we're going to put them just right, and then by the time you've done that, half an hour's gone, and you've still got to play that. You haven't even started rolling dice yet. So that's why I love first wave. I like to just get to the table, start playing.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about this at the end in terms of tournament missions and sort of what a TO maybe wants to think about when they're setting up an event. Because spoiler alert, if it's a 1-day event, with 3 games and 2 of them are deployment out of the bag, that's a huge amount of time where you're just doing admin before you've actually started turn 1.
Yeah. Well, I think as we go through, it would be quite good to rank them on a sort of a 3-tiered scale of, this is one we would choose to play. This is one we don't mind playing if we have to. And just, no thanks. Not for me. So, shall we jump into the missions?
Go for it. Do you want to kick us off with No Man's Land?
No Man's Land, an absolutely classic of a kill points mission. So No Man's Land, it is a dice in the bag deployment because there's prep bombardment, so anything in your deployment zone is at risk of being prep bombarded. That means your forward deployers are quite powerful because if they're not in your deployment zone, they're not going to get prepped. So things like your snipers, don't put them within 12 inches of your table edge. This one, so it's a classic kill points. Outflank's in play, so I'll often do an outflank, again, as I was saying earlier, to push all of my force, because often I'll reserve half my army, which is more than half my points. And so that means I've got maybe 700 points, at a stretch, coming up against a few hundred points of yours on the flank late game. So that puts me in a strong position from that strategy. But there are a couple of quirks in No Man's Land.
Yeah.
So you've done your dice deployment. Everyone's spent their time putting all their units out just nicely.
Yeah.
And then the game starts, you think, brilliant, we can start rolling dice. But you've got to be careful because in No Man's Land, there's reduced visibility. So on the first turn, you can only see 24 inches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which means if you haven't forward deployed, you're not going to be shooting anything that turn. And actually, you've spent that time doing the prep bombardment as well. You're now going to probably spend turn one rallying most of your stuff anyway. Mm-hmm. So actually, No Man's Land is one where the game doesn't really start until turn two usually.
Yeah, the chances of anything really getting off any shots in turn one's pretty limited. You might be able to, if you've got a mortar spotter, for example, your spotter's within 24 of the enemy, you may well be firing that mortar, assuming that A, you've deployed it, and B, it hasn't got pins, or it passes its order check if it has got pins. For that reason, I don't really like it, if I'm honest.
No.
It just takes a long time to set up and a long time to get going. If it's a 5-game 2-day tournament, I'm expecting to see it at some point. If it's a 3-game 1-day tournament, and if they're only playing one kill points mission, if this one's chosen over the next mission, I don't think it's the greatest choice.
No, and I think down the club, No Man's Land, when you've got all the time in the world, brilliant. You can have a nice thematic game. But at a tournament, I think if you're going to put one of these kill points ones in, put the next mission, which is meet and engagement, in. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I just want to highlight one more quirk of No Man's Land before we forget, which is you also get hidden setup, which is, alongside turret jams, one of the most forgotten rules in the game, I would say.
Yeah.
Essentially, what you do is you put your units down. If they're in cover, you can declare that they're hidden. So these units must be deployed in a way that they're either entirely in cover to all enemy that can see them, or else out of sight of enemy altogether. And then basically it gives you a -4 soft cover, -5 hard cover. Mm-hmm. It's, to be honest, I don't understand why there's a difference for soft and hard cover, because both of them are going to make you a super 6.
True.
Because you'd be well, the only time it wouldn't is if you're point blank with soft cover. That would make it 2 -4 6s to hit. But if the enemy moves within 12 of you, you stop being hidden. And so at that point, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, to be honest, it's one more thing I think that you just have to do, because essentially you put your chips. Let's see, the times that I do play it, what I do is I put a chip down next to each unit, and I don't have special chips. I just put anything that I've got to hand next to them to say, obviously, if they can't be hidden, they are hidden.
Yeah.
And then, but then you have to remember to remove those chips as they become unhidden. And usually by turn 2, they're all unhidden again. It's just one more thing that you've spent 5 minutes doing. But it does mean that on turn 1, if you do manage to, I don't know, get your tank within the 24 inches to see a unit, it's still not going to hit anything. So it just ensures that the game doesn't start until turn 2.
Yeah.
In summary, my ranking for No Man's Land is that I don't mind playing it, but I wouldn't choose to play it.
Yeah, same with me. I'm happy to see it as part of a 5-game 2-day event. On a 3-game 1-day event, I'd rather not. I wouldn't choose to play it at the club. If I'm rolling for it at the club, yeah, I'll play it if you roll for it. But no, it's not going to be my go-to. No. So
scenario 2 then is basically it's the No Man's Land that we actually want to play. I would describe it as meeting engagement. First wave, again, 1 victory point for each unit killed. There's not really much else to say about it. It does allow forward deploying. It does allow outflank. It's basically if you're going to play kill points, this is the way to go. My only criticism of meet engagement is a criticism of all kill points games, where if someone gets an early lead, like a lucky multi-launcher hit that kills 2 or 3 units, because there's no objectives that the person has to go and get, there's no real incentive to continue fighting the battle if you're 3 dice up. If you have the ability to hide for 3 turns and win the game, and you just want to win, and then there's no real incentive to draw people out, which is why I think outflank is really useful for that, because It stops people hiding in the corners.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned that, I was actually just thinking about No Man's Land. That's the other reason I don't like it, is with prep bombardment, it is possible, especially if you're playing against British, to lose 1, 2, maybe even 3 dice in your first, before you've even started playing the first turn. Admittedly, it's because you've deployed units that are really vulnerable to prep bombardment and they've rolled a 6 and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, certainly with any kill points, but particularly with No Man's Land, if you are, 2 or 3 dice down at the end of turn 1, it's very, very difficult to pull it back from there. Less so with meeting engagement because there is no prep bombardment. Outflank's interesting. So I don't use outflank a huge amount, whereas you do, Johnny. And obviously we've spoken about it in the past as to kind of how you do it and why you do it. And I think one of the reasons why I don't do it is I tend to take, veteran heavy armies, and therefore I don't have stacks and stacks of order dice. So if I put, 4, 5, 6 order dice on an outflank, I may be only playing with eight or 9 dice on the table, and not everything can actually do something if I've been cheesy and taken a mule team and that kind of thing. So I don't really want to put a huge amount of my, firepower in on the outflank, whereas you do. It's very much something that you do a lot of.
Well, it's when you first start playing, people try it, and then it seems to be the recurrent theme that they then decide, oh, you should never outflank because it means you're playing a lot of the game with half your army.
Yeah.
And actually, it can be really powerful, but I think the mistake is if you go for a middle ground. So if you do one unit, like a flamethrower team in a Jeep, that's good because it keeps the enemy in the middle of the table because they don't want to be near the edge for that flamethrower coming in.
Yeah.
So that allows you to force them together so that you can then come at them to take the dice. Or you put loads of stuff in outflank and you plan to use that outflank to take the dice by sending like at least half your army, ideally more, 600 points in a 1,000-point game, I would say. And then you try to just sweep across their back lines. The mistake, I think, is when you commit enough of your force that you've depleted your deployed force, and so you've lost a bit of that bite, but not so much that when they come in, they're going to sweep across. And so I'd say in kill points, it's an all or nothing kind of deal. Either outflank loads or outflank minimal just to force your opponent to move.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big benefits is multi-launchers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to get the outflank off, multi-launchers are super powerful because they stop people castling up in the middle.
Yeah,
because they're welcome to put all their units in the middle, but it means that I get to roll lots of dice to try and get that 6. And so people tend to then spread wide, which allows the outflanks to come in and just do a unit at a time.
Mm.
And so, all or nothing, I would say.
Okay.
Do you want to take us through key positions? I think this is one of your favourites, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Just before we do meeting engagement, in terms of how you rate it overall?
Meeting engagement, I would say this is one that I would choose to play.
Okay, yeah. Likewise, I really enjoy it because it's simple. I particularly like it at the end of a tournament or an event. Last game on the first day, or last game, after 5 games over 2 days, because you're a bit knackered at that point. You haven't got to think too much. You kind of know what you're doing. You're not faffing around with out of the bag deployment. You can just crack on and get on with it.
Yeah. On that note, actually, when you are tired, one of the things that I always do for meeting engagement is I know before I've got the table what I'm going to reserve and outflank.
Yeah.
So I write my army list almost, planning to what I'm planning to outflank with. And then I might change. There's a 10% chance I might change. But 90% of the time I rock up to the table, look at the opponent's army, and I do exactly what the battle plan was. And as you say, it means game 5, I'm not having to think about that. I can just focus on the actual turns that are happening. I'm not having to do any pre-thinking at the table.
Mm-hmm. I can feel a future episode coming on, Johnny, which is how do we create lists and what kind of things do we consider when it comes to list building?
Synergy. That's the key word
Synergy.
for me. So scenario 3, key positions. Phil's favourite.
Absolutely, yeah. And judging by our Facebook poll, which we ran recently, your favourite as well. So thank you to the listeners that did vote in that. I really like key positions. For a number of reasons. One, it kind of makes sense in, if you're thinking about it beyond being a game. You've got two forces opposing each other. You're trying to grab and hold and seize ground. That kind of makes sense. In terms of why I like it as a game, you've got a bit of movement going on. You do need to think about, sacrificing units, taking your opponent's units with regards to how many units you've got left to actually keep hold of that objective, and how many units they've got left to kind of seize it off you. Placement of objectives becomes a major thing before you've even actually started on turn one. And again, for me, that comes down to what army I've got and what army my opponent's got. You can outflank in it as well, so it's got everything that I feel makes a good mission.
The only thing that's not as thematic is because the game just ends at some point, and like usually turn 6, possibly turn 7. It does mean that you could just have one man holding each objective, facing 3 tigers or something ridiculous. Yeah. And obviously, in the real world, you've lost the battle, but in the game terms, you've won. And that's the only thing that's the only outcome where key positions isn't that thematic.
Yeah, but I think we can suspend at that point, our themey real world bit. Yeah. I actually quite like it because of that very reason, in that you have to play to 6 turns.
Yeah.
And with the possibility of 7. And I've certainly had, games in the past where I've been winning on turn 6. Just because I've been clawing on, with a 1 or 2 man unit onto an objective, and I've either drawn or lost it in turn 7. I've been praying to not play turn 7. It's gone to turn 7, and because I've depleted my opponent's depleted my army, I've been in a situation where I've gone from a winning position at the end of turn 6. We've rolled and played turn 7, and it's not been a result for me that I've wanted at the end of it.
100%. So jumping into the specifics of key positions.
Yeah.
It is a first wave mission, which I love because you're not having to faff around putting units down for 10 minutes. You place D3 plus 2. You place them before you choose table sides, which is a really important part of this, because what I'll tend to do if I'm playing a fast army is I'll stack one side of the table with 2 objectives, because either I win the roll-off, get lucky, get that side of the table, or I'm planning to run across the table anyway, so I'll come and get them from you.
Yeah.
But you get D3 plus 2, which means on average you're getting sort of 4 objectives. The only thing I don't like in key positions is when there's an even number of objectives, because I like to have a clear winner and loser, and so odd is my preference. And the only other thing to mention with the objectives is rules as written. It's 3 inches of the center of the objective.
Yeah.
Now I prefer if you play with sort of 50 mil circle. Yeah. Objective markers, and then play touching, just because it makes it much easier. I think if you are going to play 3 inches of center, you should definitely have some mark in the center of that token, just because it makes it easier to measure from. It's often not a huge thing, but every now and then you'll have a unit where it's a very close call whether they are within that 3 inches. Yeah, whereas touching, a lot of tournaments have gone that way. I think the Welsh Nationals was touching, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Because Reese, I know, has that same mentality where it's he just likes it to be a little bit cleaner that way. Yeah. One other change you often see as well is what can hold objectives. So in the main rulebook, it's basically everything. I think they FAQ'd that spotters and medics can't, and empty transports can't.
It's not quite. No, it's not everything. It is. So reading it as written, it's there must be a model from one of your infantry or artillery units, or a transport including one such unit. So you can't hold it with an armoured car or a tank, for example.
Yeah.
So it's infantry or artillery, or a transport with a unit inside it, or being towed.
Oh, so that's the vehicle exception. Because that sometimes catches people out of tournaments, because sometimes there's a tournament rule specifically where you have to get out of your transport to hold it, and sometimes that catches people out at other tournaments where their opponent doesn't get out the transport, so the person who is playing it the other way thinks, they haven't got it, and then at the end of the game, no, they do.
It turns out, yeah. But you can contest, though, with any unit that is eligible to contest. So, medics, chaplains, and spotters for artillery and mortars don't count. But it does mean, obviously, you can contest with an armoured vehicle, but you can't hold.
The one other change that I do quite like is if you are playing touching, the problem is you can park a tank on top of it. And then if someone destroys the tank is impassable. So one of the changes that I like is if you're doing a tournament, just add a little rule where the tank chassis then becomes the objective, essentially.
Yeah.
And so you can touch the tank to get the objective. I just like because it keeps it in play.
Yeah, it's similar. If you put an objective in a building and you blow the building up or you burn the building down, then it becomes impassable. Quite often what you'll see, and it may even be in the rulebook, to be fair, is that if you're touching the edge of where that building was, and it's a smouldering wreck of a ruin, that would count as well.
Yeah, I don't think it is in the rulebook because with the 3-inch rule, it's just intended that you have to be within 3 inches of it. But, I mean, a lot of people don't mind the risk, so both ways are playable. I just prefer to keep all the objectives in play so that there's no opportunity for people to knock objectives out. When they've lost all their troops, just go, you know what, I'm just going to keep parking on them so that it's a draw.
Any tactics from you as to where you place objectives?
As I said before, I tend to put them in your half.
Okay.
Because I'm coming at you with my fast armies. If I was playing slow armies, I'd go more centered. So if I play Finns, for example, I'll often go more centered and then fight in the middle.
Yeah.
But if I'm playing a fast army like my Americans and Dodgers, I'm going to put 2 on one side. If it's 3 objectives, I'm going to try to get 2 of them on one side so that I either win the setup, put my 2 artillery pieces on my 2 mortars on them, and then just fight the rest of the battle, distracting you. Or if I lose the roll-off, I'm going to run across the table and take them off you. What about you? What are you thinking on that?
I was going to ask you actually, Johnny, in terms of distance between objectives, because I've seen people play it in different ways. I've seen some people where they'll spread the objectives out, particularly if they've got a lot of units that can potentially capture and hold that objective. And I've seen the opposite where, because you have to be 12 inches away, one objective from the next objective, they'll put it 12.1 inches away. Yeah, which is particularly lethal if you've got Gurkhas or you play Japanese, for example, where you can just throw people into the mix and assault units off an objective.
Yeah, well, with this, it depends how many objectives there are. It depends if I get to go. But let's say ideal scenario, it's 3 objectives. I get to place 2 of them, and I'm playing like my fast American list. Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 of them 12 inches apart. And then you can put your third one wherever you like because I'm not going to play for it. Yeah. And then, because there's no kill points in this, I don't care if I lose my entire army. I'm just going to go take those 2 objectives and I'm going to try to push past them and basically just create a wall in front of it. So, yes, I'll lose most of my army, but it's because you've only got 6 turns to get past the wall. The idea is that it's enough of a roadblock to stop you getting on them. And then because I've just abandoned one of the objectives, anything you've put on to get that is essentially not fighting me. And so I can just disregard it. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll look at the table. So if for example, the way it's been played is 3 inches of the center, what I'm not necessarily going to do is to put an objective in cover, because that's giving an advantage, obviously, to the person who's holding that objective. I'll move it so that you can't, for example, I'll place the objective, so that you can't, for example, hide around the edge of a building or behind, dense terrain. Still be within 3 inches, but be very difficult to actually get to and shift. I'll especially do it if I'm playing Paris, for example, and I've got stubborn units. If I've got a bunch of stubborn units, veteran stubborn units, I'll probably put the objectives in the middle where there's not a huge amount of cover because I'm likely to be able to withstand that fire. Especially if my opponent's got, a bunch of regulars or inexperienced squads where they're just going to get mowed down if they're the ones sat on that objective in the open.
Yeah, if I'm running that Dodge heavy list for the Americans, the conversation I always have beforehand is what we're going to do with vehicles, because the rule book says decide with your opponent whether the vehicles stay. And so I always have that conversation because if the soft-skinned vehicles are going to stay, I'll sacrifice my Dodgers by I'll place the objectives in the open, planning to drive the Dodge past the objective, turn it sideways, and then if you destroy it, I'll just hope that enough men survive and fall out onto the objective. Yeah. And then now they're behind a nice little Dodge-shaped wall.
Which is basically what you did in at the Welsh Nationals, as we talked about in episode 1.
Yeah, untimely, because running a regular army, as I usually do, you can't weather the storm without some cover. And so that's what I'm thinking by doing that. Yeah. Any other thoughts on key positions before we move on to scenario 4?
I really like it, and I do like to see it in events and tournaments.
So that's a would choose to play for you?
100%, yeah.
I'm not It's not my very favourite, but
Okay.
I certainly am happy to play this one. So at a tournament, I'm happy when it comes up because it's a nice one. Everyone knows how to play it,
Yeah.
and it usually get a nice clean game.
Mm-hmm.
So scenario 4, double envelopment,
Yeah.
which is one that's less popular, a bit of a mixed response, I'd say, from people.
It's a bit of a Marmite mission, isn't it? You either love it or you hate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I like it because you
Mm-hmm.
can play it. So the criticism of it is, I find, is that, oh, well, if I've got a slow army, then I've lost, haven't I, because I can't run across the table.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't think that's true because I think there's actually 3 ways to play double envelopment. I think if you're fast, you can run across the table and go for the 3 victory points for getting off the table.
Yeah.
If you're slow, then you get 1 victory point for every unit destroyed. So all you have to do is stand on the edge of your deployment zone and just play kill points.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you can play somewhere between. If you're something like Americans but without transports, you can play a normal kill points game, but sort of fire and maneuver up the board so that at the end of the game, you're getting 2 victory points for, I don't know, maybe your Ranger squad that got into his deployment zone, or I don't know, your bazooka that went chasing the tiger and then in the last turn it did a dash to get 2 victory points. And so actually, because there's 3 different ways to play it, depending on how you've built your army, I actually think it's a fairly balanced game.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like it. I remember when I first played it, it was a bit like Wacky Races, and you often hear it being described as Wacky Races because you and your opponent are just dashing for the other side and waving at each other in the middle. But actually, as I've played it more and I've got to think about different tactics, I do really like it because you can win in certainly 1 or 3 different ways. Yeah,
Yeah. I often play convoy where if I've got lots of transports, they often will just look for the gap in the line and try and race through it. I saw a Japanese player, and obviously with Banzai, you think, oh, amazing, you'll just be able to Banzai across the board.
Banzai
and actually,
board, yeah.
He did the opposite, where what he did is he reserved loads of stuff and then set up on his back line and just let them come to him and then did all the close quarters on his side of the table, essentially. And then obviously won them because of the fanatics.
Yeah.
And so he played it a way I wasn't expecting, but did really well with it. In terms of the mission specifics, this one is one of the only 3 missions that doesn't have outflank for fairly obvious reasons, because what you would do is just outflank turn 5 or 6 and just drive off the board.
Yep.
It is dice deployment.
Yes.
But you have to reserve half.
Yep.
Rounded down. And so what I do is I reserve my fast stuff. And I deploy the stuff that's planning to stay in the deployment zone anyway. Because usually that's stuff like artillery that actually I want to get a shot off on turn 1.
Yes. Yeah.
Or if I'm playing American, sometimes I take 3 machine guns, which is often criticised as being not very competitive. But actually, for 105 points for 3 machine guns that you can put in ambush turn 1, it often gives people pause when they're trying to rush across the board.
Yeah.
Not much else to say on double envelopment from me.
No.
What about yourself?
No, like I said, I do like it. I'll be very similar to you. I will. My reserves are going to be my fast units. I'm going to want to deploy stuff that I can use on turn 1, or things that are slow, but they're going to be hanging. They will survive because I need to get them, or I want to get them, quite high up the board. Have to be a bit careful not to isolate yourself, and not to push a unit or 2 too far forward without support. Particularly because obviously you are rolling for reserves, so there's a chance that your other units won't come in. But yeah, I do like it. So originally, I think the first few times I played it, it was like, what on earth is going on? It's just, dash for the other side. But actually, now I've played it a lot more. I do enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one that I would want to play on our scale.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
On our ranking system. So scenario 5. Very few people's favourite mission. I think 1 person voted for it in the poll. Sorry, I take that back. 2 people thought said this was the best mission. 1 person did comment as well, actually saying that they liked it because they thought it was a fun one to show new players the game. Which I think if you've built both armies around this mission, so you've balanced it, that's potentially true. I haven't actually said what the mission is. It's top secret.
That's because the mission is top secret, and that's why you didn't tell us.
Exactly. But now you're in the know. So top secret, it's the only mission where your full army reserves and there's no forward deployers. So it's the only mission where there's no forward deploys as well.
Yeah.
The mission is, there's a single objective in the middle. You go and grab it. You can hand it off once per turn, and then you basically just have to run off the table. Mm-hmm. And so if this is going to be in a tournament pack, which it really shouldn't be, but if it is, what you want to take is something like cavalry or people in trucks, something like that, where turn 1. So what I would do is I'd put a 10-man veteran squad in a truck with a lieutenant, regular truck, so it's testing a 10 to come on.
Yeah.
And I would probably go 24 inches up the board the turn it arrives, maybe with the last dice of the turn. And then the squad get out and then grab it and run back.
Yeah, testing at 9 to come on.
Oh, sorry, I'm thinking Americans.
You're thinking Americans,
I'm in my American system, yeah. Yeah, so with the Americans, well, if this is the only game I'm going to play, I could even stretch to a first lieutenant, because we're not fighting over the battle. All I'm going to take is trucks, veterans, and stuff to boost morale, basically, because I just need to keep passing tests and passing that objective back off the table.
Yeah, you can daisy chain it, can't you? Yeah. One thing I have seen, which is interesting, this was at an event recently, is changing it so that you didn't have to get the briefcase or whatever it is you're playing off the board. You just had to, and you couldn't take it off the board, but you had to be in possession of it at the end of turn 6 or turn 7.
Yeah.
So you kind of scramble for the middle and grab it, and then you're basically running to like the far corner. So that does keep it, interesting. It gives you something to play for. If you're not there first of all onto that token, for example.
That's the only way to fix it, I think. One of the other ones that I've seen, one of the other changes I've seen is sometimes it's you can't move it. So it's basically key positions but with a single objective. And I personally think that's a bad change to the mission, because what it means is, of that 6x4, the only bit that matters is that 12-inch square in the middle. And so all you're going to do is just fight an entire battle in a 12-inch square. So I don't think that's a good change to the mission. And again, what I would do if I was playing it like that is I would just circle the wagons, park the Dodgers in a ring around it to stop you getting to it, and then just park the rest of my army in there, just going down, and then you're going to have to do close quarters every turn, try and get me out. So this is one for me that, no thanks, I'll let someone else play that one.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Yeah, I think the only time it's good is if you're doing something like a Sea Lion campaign, where the Germans have landed in Britain. They're trying to grab some intelligence, so maybe they're trying to kidnap a high-ranking official, and so the high-ranking official's in the middle of the table, and then you have a bit of sort of thematic play, and also because it's not a tournament game, you've made sure that the armies that are facing off are equally ranked on, like, in terms of speed and how well they can play the game. Brilliant. So that's Top Secret wrapped up, I'd say. Demolition, do you want to talk us through that one?
Not really. I don't like it either.
You don't like Demolition?
I don't like Demolition.
I never used to, but I've grown, not fond, I would say.
Okay.
But I've gotten to a point with Demolition where I've come to accept it.
Okay, come to accept it. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, I will talk about it. But yeah, it's not my favorite. Spoiler alert there. So what you're trying to do is essentially get onto your opponent's base, and the base then needs to be deployed up to 20 inches away from the table middle line. So it's more than 4 inches. Well, 4 inches or more away from your baseline. You do that depending on who wins the dice roll. Yeah, first person goes first, second person does theirs, and you can leave stuff in reserve. You can outflank in this mission, and you're deploying out the bag. And then the way you win is if you get an enemy unit is touching the base, and your base is still intact by the end of that turn.
The problem with Demolition, and which is, I imagine, why you don't like playing it, is because it is a bit like the Top Secret, where you're just going to race towards that one objective.
Yeah.
And so if someone's got veterans, they can just block it off, and then it just becomes a stalemate. And so actually Demolition can often end in a draw.
Yes.
The thing that does make it work a bit better is outflank can potentially go in your favour. And so if there's a reason why they don't put it right in the centre and you outflank correctly to the right side, and you manage to have enough of your force coming forward to distract them that the outflankers can come in, then you have potential. I mean, if you really just want to win demolition, take the Finns and then use the counterpartio who have the special rule where you can outflank from your opponent's table edge.
Yeah.
And then all you do is you spearhead everything else up the board at the objective. And then while they're dealing with that, the guys just jump out from behind and set on the objective at the end of the turn.
Yeah. I think the reason why I don't like it is it often ends in a draw. And when I have seen it in events, particularly if it's a 3-game event, it just doesn't differentiate between your players.
Yeah, and also it's one that's unbalanced because this one, the criticism we had of double envelopment earlier where, if someone brings a slow army, well, actually, in this one, it really will hurt you if you bring a slow army because you can't get to their base. I think the way to fix it is you add kill points for units killed. So you could just play it as kill points if you decide you're not going to go for the base. And then you add victory points for destroying the base. So then as a player, you have a choice. Am I going to lose loads of victory points trying to take their base, but then I might get 10 victory points, let's say, for destroying it, and the game ends immediately? Or do I just play it as kill points? And I think that would add a little dynamic to it. The reason I've come to sort of accept it is I think it's better than Top Secret in terms of its balance, but it's still not a tournament mission. It still requires pre-planning, I think, for it to be a good game.
Yeah. It's quite situational and niche, but if you have, let's say you're playing as the Aussies, because you can forward deploy in demolition, or you're playing as the British or Japanese with native irregulars. You start forward deploying 8-man veteran units of PAP ones or native irregulars and so on. You're up to 24 inches up the board already. If you've got mobile units behind who you can push forward and support, it can be over by turn 3.
Oh yeah, I think that is the thing with demolition. It either ends like that quickly, or it goes to turn 6 draw. Because as you're saying that, one of the things I noticed is it's dice in the bag deployment, but there's no prep, and so what I would probably do is if I'm playing an army with lots of transports, I'm going to load up the transports, and if they're wheeled, I'm going to go 24 inches forward turn 1, or as close to that as possible, so that turn 2. I can then just get out as close as possible to the objective, and I just have to get one squad, get lucky, and run onto it.
I'm just thinking about that. If you've got rangers, so you're deploying 12 inches, you're then you're doing your ranger run, another 12 inches, so you're up to the halfway line before you started turn 1, and then off you go.
So I'd say for me, that's one of the missions that I don't want to play. So it's a bit of a no thanks mission, but if it's down the club, I don't mind it too much. What about you? I assume that's just a no tar from you.
It's a no,
Scenario 7 then is envelopment. So envelopment is a movement mission, but it's because it's an attacker defender mission, it's an asymmetrical mission where there's different victory conditions for different sides.
Yeah.
The defender sets up not using dice in the bag because the attacker's first wave. So this defender just sets up. There's potentially a prep bombardment. Your victory conditions are that the attacker gets 1 victory point for a kill, 2 for being in the deployment zone, 3 for getting off the other side of the table. The defender gets 2 victory points for every order dice killed. So as the defender, you're just trying to kill. As the attacker, you're either trying to kill twice as much as your opponent or get across the table.
Or both,
Or both, which would be the ideal outcome. For me, the thing that, again, this is a bit like Demolition, where it can be a good game if you've set up for it, but it's not a tournament game because you can't just randomly pick 2 armies, throw them into envelopment, and expect a balanced game. And what I mean by that is, if I'm the attacker and I've taken a German platoon with 88s, no transports, let's say all veterans, so I don't have that many dice and none of them can go 24 inches a turn, it's going to be very difficult for me to get across that table.
Yeah, well, Luftwaffe Defense Force, for example. LDF, there we go. That theatre selector.
So if that happens, I'm essentially playing meeting engagement, but I'm at the disadvantage that every time I lose something, I go 2 points down, and every time I kill something, I only go 1 point up. And so that would unbalance it. And so that's why I think it can be a good balanced game, but equally, it's for tournaments, it's a bit of a risk, because if you get that unmatched pairing, it's going to guarantee one side wins.
I've seen it at an event. It was at the Welsh Open last year. So Mark ran it. And what he did, which I particularly liked, was he made the allies be the defenders to effectively negate any British players with the prep bombardment as the attacker getting their 2 dice rolls per unit, for example. I actually quite like it because it is quite themey. Yeah, if it's a straightforward, tournament rather than an event, for example, it's not a great mission for a tournament setting. Something like the Welsh Open, where it's quite thematic and it's a little bit more lighthearted than a full-on, competitive, fully competitive event or tournament. Sorry, I quite like it.
And I can't remember if the Welsh Open did this last year, but if you pre-release your mission pack saying envelopment will be in it, so players are prepared, then it means they're not going to build themselves an army that can't even engage in the mission. Then I think, it's absolutely fine for those open type of tournaments. A lot of fun. Because I think that would, if you're a newer player and you thought, this is a nice fun tournament, I'll build a thematic army, and you turn up and you know from before even turn 1 you can't win the mission, I think that's still going to be no fun for you. And so that's why I think pre-releasing it is probably the one time you'll see it in a tournament setting where actually you'll still get really good games consistently.
Yeah, I've seen it as well at thematic events where it's been one of 3 missions, for example, and there's a narrative going on, and this particular narrative is, you're trying to break through a defensive position in order to exploit, behind the lines. In that sense, I think it works quite well as part of a thematic narrative rather than a full-on competitive tournament.
Yeah, I think it would be great if you did a team tournament where let's say you're a team of 3, and each round you play 3 different missions. So the captain of the team chose which army fought which mission based on its strengths. So, let's say I bring my fast Americans, you brought your LDF force, and someone's brought, I don't know, some Brits. If there's 3 different missions on the go, so you could say, actually, the LDF aren't going to be good at development, we'll put the US on that. Then I think that's another place you could do it. Brilliant. So I think that's envelopment basically wrapped up. For me, I would say I don't mind playing it, but I prefer not to see it without forewarning. What about you?
Yeah, down the club, quite good fun. As a sort of introductory game, quite good fun as well. To be honest, I'm just chuckling at your joke about envelopment being wrapped up, but there we go.
I thought that had flown under the radar. So, scenario 8 then, Manhunt. Do you want me to jump into this one, or would you like to?
No, can you do this one? Because I don't like it. It just reminds me of the Benny Hill sketch.
100% this is the problem with this mission. So, Manhunt, the victory condition is you're trying to capture the enemy officer.
Yeah.
The problem is you have to capture him by fighting him in close quarters. It's an attacker first wave mission, and your reserves have the confused fight rule where they can come on from any table edge. And that's on both sides as well. So what that means is if their officer tries to run back to their table edge, well, you might come out from there. But equally, because you can't charge the turn you spring up, that gives their officer 1 turn to run 12 inches away from the squad that's just turned up. And then that's why it turns into the Benny Hill sketch. So, not a good mission overall, I would say.
Yeah.
Potentially a good mission if you're doing, again, like a Sea Lion campaign where you're trying to capture someone, but that's because you both prepared armies that work with it, and both sides have a chance. I think if you want to make it playable generally, you do like what we said with Demolition earlier, where you make the officer worth something, and then you play kill points, and then you basically play, if you kill the officer, you get X additional kill points. So let's say 10 additional kill points for just killing the officer. If you're going to do that, I'd take away the confused fight, so it's a little bit more difficult to get to the officer. And again, the other reason I'm not a fan of confused fight is if the tables are close together, like there would be at a tournament or at a lot of clubs, walking around the table to deploy optimally, this side this time, this side that time, it's a bit of a no-go, really, if you've got another table pushed against yours.
Yeah.
I imagine you've got quite similar thoughts on Manhunt.
I don't like it, and I wouldn't choose to play it, and that's my thoughts.
So it's a no tar from me, and it's a no tar from...
It's a big fat no from me, yeah.
So, keep it brief then. Move on to scenario 9, point defense. I think it's your turn to go through one, please, sir.
Yep, so point defense. So the concept of this then is that the enemy's occupying a perfect defensive position, and as the attacker, it's your mission to push them out and send them packing. So it's an objective mission. There are 3 objectives. The defender must nominate 3 separate objectives in this setup zone. These objectives must be at least 6 inches from the defender's table edge, and they have to be 24 inches from each other. And effectively, the attacker is trying to take these objectives from the defender. The defender is set up beforehand. The attacker is first wave. There is a prep bombardment. And yeah, essentially what you're trying to do is hold more objectives. So if the attacker holds 2 or 3 objectives, the attacker wins. If the attacker holds 1 objective, it's a draw. And then if the attacker holds no objectives, the defender wins.
Yeah. And so the victory conditions there are one of the problems I have with it, where usually what happens is the attacker gets 1 and it's a draw. Because it's very hard to get all 3 or even 2, because I believe you said they have to be 24 inches apart.
They have to be 24 inches apart and at least 6 inches away from the back line, yeah.
So you're saying I have to run across the table, split my force 24 inches apart, and then also survive long enough to be on them at the end of the game. It's going to be very difficult unless I either get lucky, I have an ideal matchup in terms of what I've built in my army and what you've built in your army. And so generally, I would probably choose to be the defender this one if I get a say in it. And then I would do the classic thing, a bit like in the way we said you could play a double envelopment, where you just stand back and play kill points. And just create roadblocks to try and slow them down.
Yeah, because you can outflank in this one. As a defender, you have to put your objective 6 inches or at least 6 inches away from your table edge. So you put it 6.1 inches away. You put the first one bang in the center, and then you put the other 2 either side 24 inches. So you're only playing on 48 inches of a 6-foot board. So you're kind of protected a little bit from being outflanked, and you've put it right away from the attacker's table edge. So they've got 4 foot and 3 foot and whatever it is, 3 foot and 6 inches to get across. So very, very difficult.
You could do it another way as well, where actually you do put one of them right on the flank as close as possible, and then play it on, let's say, my right side of the table, and just ignore the left flank. And then that allows me as the defender to castle up more. And then also, if you do decide to outflank there, I've got loads of time to set up all the ambushes and everything to deal with you. Or one of the strategies that's often frowned upon, but I don't have a huge problem with it if someone does it against me, where you string yourself down the flank so that the person can't actually outflank in your back lines, because you can't go within range of my models. And I don't have a huge problem with that, because I think it's horrible if someone does it to you and you're not expecting it. But because that was a thing a few years ago, I remember everyone got it happened once and someone was caught off guard, and so it caused a bit of upset. Now that people are aware of it, I don't mind it as much. It would be horrible to be caught off guard by it if I've outflanked everything and then you've just blocked the entire flank. But because it's a strategy I am aware of now, if you did it to me, I wouldn't be too upset about it. But even if I didn't do that, even if I said that's not a fair strategy, I'd still just put my entire army on ambush on that flank, and then it means that I can ignore that side of the table. So I know you're only coming down my right flank, let's say. But yeah, I'd say again, it's one that could work, but it's not. It's one that is a bit of a risk if you don't know what armies people are bringing. So for me, I don't mind playing it, but it's not one that I would generally choose to play unless we'd pre-planned it.
Yeah, I think as a sort of thematic pre-planned game, I think it can be good. And again, you can create a narrative there. And, I have seen it played at events where it's been part of a 3-game, narrative. In an open kind of competitive tournament, no.
One note before we move on, actually, is that the deployment in my rulebook, they might have changed it for later printings, but usually it says when you can put half in reserve, so the defender has to set up at least half with the rest in reserve, usually it tells you which way to round if you've got an odd number of order dice. It doesn't in this one. And so what I'd say is you round up. And what I mean by that is you round up what you're deploying so you have more on the table than you have in reserve, because that's how it works in Meet and Engagement in No Man's Land. And so there's no reason to presume that would be any different here. But that's not a strategic point. That's just something that I noticed.
Yeah, I'm just checking my rulebook, and the printed version, it's the same. It doesn't specify rounding up or down. So, yeah.
And I don't think it would make a huge difference to your game. But that was my thoughts. I'll just play it the way that we play the other ones. So that's point defense. So moving on to scenario 10, hold until relieved, which is a bit of a mad one compared to the other ones, I'd say.
Yeah.
So objective in the middle on this one. The defender sets up 1 infantry and 1 other unit of their choice, so it doesn't have to be infantry. However, it can't have an armor value of 8 or higher. It has a maximum armor value of 7. So you could put 2 infantry, you could put an infantry and a half track, that's armor 7, or you could put your infantry and your artillery. The attacker then sets up... So the attacker then sets up anywhere on the table 18 inches away from the defender's units.
Yep.
Or the objective. And it says they set up any and all infantry with the rest in reserve. Now, reading that, does that mean you have to deploy every single infantry unit that you've got in your army?
Yeah.
In the actual rulebook, what it says is that the attacker can then set up any and all infantry. And so...
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah.
Because we've got the can, but then it does say all infantry. I think the way that I've played it previously, when I have played this, is you don't have to deploy everything. You have a choice.
Yeah, so I think just breaking that sentence down. So they can set up any infantry and indeed all of their infantry, but they could deploy none of their infantry and therefore just deploy artillery and vehicles, for example.
So my only complaint with that reading of it is if I don't have to set up any of my infantry, all of the units are left in reserve, there is no minimum requirement to set up. And so I could play turn 1 with nothing on the table if we use that reading.
Yes.
So I could just refuse to play turn 1. Yeah.
That wasn't very convincing,
which would be a bit bizarre.
Yeah.
And I don't think it would be strategically the great decision to make. But it would be a really bizarre thing to do to spend turn 1 not on the table at all. Because the defender has first wave. The other reason it's a really bizarre one is you do 2 on the table, then of what's left, half of it rounding down is your first wave, and then the rest of it's reserved. So I've played this at a tournament back in the day, the Warlord GT, and it was an absolute head scratcher trying to deploy, because you're doing 2, and then I take the 2 off my total order dice, then I half that, round that down, choose that many used to be first wave, then the rest reserve. Outflank is in play, I believe. So then I have to work out if I'm putting stuff in reserve, if I'm going to outflank them. I think what I did at the time was just put as much out as possible. I think I was the attacker, so I didn't have to worry about that. So, no, for me, I think if this came up late in a tournament, like game 4 or 5 of a tournament, I'm probably not going to be able to get my head around it.
No. I've never played it at an event. I have played it down the club. Actually, I can remember a particularly fun game where I was playing British Commandos, and it was all very themey, and the commandos were kind of holed up in the centre of the table, waiting for the rest of the their mates to arrive and support them or reinforce them. It's not an event. It's not a mission for an event, is it? But I think if you can work out the setup rules, clearly we can't based on the last 2 minutes or so. But if you can work out the setup rules, I think it could be quite good fun down the club, or as an introductory game for somebody. You can kind of spin quite a nice little narrative around it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great thematic one.
Yeah.
Too much it's not. I think the problem is it's not played often enough to be smooth at a tournament. And so maybe if we practice it, we might find that actually it is fairly balanced. It might be one worth including in a tournament pack.
Yeah.
But in its current iteration, for me, it's one where I don't mind playing it, but I'd rather see it down the club than at a tournament where I'm having to think too hard.
Yeah, I'll be interested if people are listening to this and you like it. Please comment on the post that we put up on Facebook about favourite missions and why. Because there will be people out there that do enjoy playing it, and it'll be interesting to hear why.
I think from a strategic point of view as well, I would be trying to get my artillery on as soon as possible.
Yeah.
As the attacker, I'm probably going to put as much on as possible. I probably won't use that advantage of putting stuff on your side of the table because your first wave's just going to obliterate it.
Yes.
I'm probably going to do a fairly normal deployment on my side of the table. And if I'm the defender, I think I'm going to put throwaway units in the middle and plan to use my first wave as the actual units that are going to take it, because there's too much. You're facing too much early game with just 2 units. But equally, as I say, I haven't played a huge amount, so it may be that strategic advice is terrible. So your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
So moving on to scenario 11, it's another bit of a madcap one. It's Surrounded.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk us through Surrounded, Phil?
Yeah, so it is absolutely a mad one. So it's an attacker-defender mission. So you roll off to see who's attacker, who's defender. The defender picks a side of the table, and they set up half of their units rounding down within 12 inches of the center of the table. They can be hidden, and all other units are left in reserve. And then the attacker, none of their units are set up at the start of the game. They must nominate half of their units rounding up to form the first wave. Everything else is left in reserve. And let me just check my notes. You can outflank in the sense that it's a confused fight. So you've just got people coming in all over the place, haven't you? So the interesting thing about this is the confused fight rules. So you are able to come on from every table edge depending on where the previous enemy unit came on.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it a lot of fun, and B, difficult, as we said earlier, with certain venues where if the tables are pushed together, you don't get that fun element of surprising people by where you come from, because if it takes you 5 minutes to walk around the table because you're in the middle of a row of 5, you're not going to make best use of the confused fight. It's always going to discourage you from walking around the table. I actually think it has potential to be a fairly balanced mission. My only concern with it is that if you take a multi-launcher on a truck like a Katusha or Panzerwerfer 42, the problem is you can come on from reserve, and basically if you're the defenders have had to set up within 12 inches of the middle, that means every single unit in the middle there, so half their entire army, is probably going to be rolled against with that multi-launcher. Yeah. And so if it's a tournament where 1 or 2 multi-launchers on trucks are in play, that could really swing the game. But other than that, it has potential to be fair, especially if the table design is designed around this specific mission. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe it's just a city board where there aren't that many lanes of fire into the middle, so the defender actually gets a little bit more time sort of preparing their position, because they are experiencing a prep bombardment as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is going to slow them right down.
Yeah.
So because the attacker's getting the first wave, the defender's got a prep bombardment. I actually think the prep bombardment's a bit unnecessary. I suppose the reason they've done that is to stop the defender, if they've got the dice advantage, putting their entire army that's on the table into ambush to just prepare for it.
Yeah. Yeah, because you'd be rallying off pins potentially. Yeah. And it's a straightforward kill points mission, so you need to get two victory points more than your opponent, and it's 1 victory point for every enemy unit destroyed.
Yeah, and that's why I think it has potential to be a really fair mission. It's just that I think every now and then there'll be something quirky that comes up, like that multi-launcher issue where the first wave the multi-launcher comes in and just everything in that 12-inch bubble is at risk.
Yeah.
Cool. So for me, it's one that I don't mind seeing, but it's one that I would choose to play down the club as well. It's one that I'd actually quite like to play down the club, but it's one that I wouldn't recommend as a universal tournament mission.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it at an event or a tournament, but I have played it a few times down the club. It is quite good fun, and again, you can kind of make a sort of narrative around it.
So, scenario 12, and one of my favourites, sectors. So, before we get into the meat of sectors, this is one where, a bit like Double Envelopment, when I first played it, I never used to like it.
Okay.
I don't know why. I think it was because it always felt difficult.
Yeah.
To sort of get across the table diagonally, and but actually, like Double Envelopment, haven't played it quite a lot because it is one that's included in a lot of tournament packs.
Yeah.
I've grown quite fond of it because you can play it multiple ways. I'll talk through the specifics of it before I talk about the ways to play it. So it's a movement mission. Just like Double Envelopment, you get one for killing an order dice, one for getting into the neutral quarter. So the deployment for this is table quarters rather than sides. And you and your opponent are diagonally opposite. So if you get into the neutral ones, one of the ones that wasn't used for the deployment, you get 1 victory point, and 3 victory points for getting into the opponent's deployment zone, so diagonally opposite. The reason I think, like Double Envelopment, it's not bad is because you can play it the same 3 ways that you play Double Envelopment. You can play it either, I'm going to create a blockade and fight kill points, or you could play the opposite, where you're just going to convoy as quickly as possible to get as many victory points for being in the deployment zone. Or you can play the middle ground, where you do fight the battle to try and get as many kill points as possible, and then do a late game dash to get the 3 victory points for the units that can do it. So because of that, I actually think it is a pretty balanced mission for most army types.
I think it's one where reserves are absolutely critical in terms of what you reserve, when you bring them on, and what you do with them. Because
yes,
it is absolutely possible to reserve 2 or 3 units in a transport, and then just rush them into the scoring zone, your opponent's zone. Turn 5, turn 6 kind of thing. Equally, if you've kind of completely left your zone empty, you may need to use your reserves to actually stop your opponent just rushing into your zone as well. So, yeah, it's not. There's definitely not one way of playing this one at all.
Oh no, it does often. The way that I play it often does descend into what I call the whirlpool of death, where basically, let's say I've chosen the right quarter. I'll rush as much as possible off my left flank. They'll do the opposite because I've basically abandoned my quarter, and we'll just pivot around each other, just taking pot shots at each other until the end of the game, when we just count up how many units are on each other's quarters. And that's what I did at the Welsh Nationals, because I had 24 dice and I had 6 trucks. I put 6 units in the 6 trucks, reserved that, and then just made a dash for it. And the one mistake that I made that nearly cost me the game, because that would have been 36 victory points for getting them in. And the one mistake that I think I made there, but it didn't cost me the game luckily, was I sort of slowed the convoy down to go and have a few little side battles. Because I thought, I've got a flamethrower in this truck. If he gets out, he'll quickly deal with these horses. But of course he didn't. And now what would have been 6 victory points in the zone, I'm now risking in the middle of the table fighting a battle I didn't really need to fight. But actually, on that note, one of the reasons I did that was because the secondary was in the middle. And that's one of the ways with the kill point missions. One of the problems I have is there's no incentive to not hide sometimes. But actually, if there's a secondary objective at events, that's one of the things that can draw people out again. And that's what drew me into the middle of the table on sectors rather than just abandoning most of the table.
Yeah, and I think as well with sectors, you often hear people saying that if you've got a high order dice count army, and you're playing against that high order dice count army, it's very difficult to win. There absolutely, that is true because of the way the scoring system works. That said, though, the armies with high order dice count will, by default, have poor quality troops, which will be easier to kill. So don't just kind of be resigned to going, my opponent's got 7, 8, 9 dice more than me, I'm going to lose this. There's a reason why they've got 7, 8, 9 dice. It's because their units aren't very good.
That game that I was just talking about, if I'd come up against their army basically in a line on the edge of their quarter, it would have been very easy to stop the convoy, because it was all soft skin transports. So that even the riflemen are going to either slow them down by putting pins on them or immobilize them, destroy them.
Pop them,
At that point, because we were playing that the vehicles stay, not only have I lost my 3 victory points, potentially 6 because I've lost the unit inside, I also have created a block for my next transport. So my next transport can't whiz 24 up the board anymore. It now has to do a 12-inch advance to do 2 turns around the destroyed transport.
Yeah.
And so actually there are ways, as you say, if someone's got 20 to 24 dice, they're averaging sort of 50 points a unit. All their units will be very soft and squishy, and you just have to factor that in as to how you play the mission. One note as well with this, forward deployment is in play, and because prepped bombardment's happening, you definitely want to take things like your sniper and put them in the neutral quarter.
Yeah, definitely,
Because A, they're not getting prepped, and B, they're worth a victory point before you've even started the game.
Yeah.
Because even if that forward artillery observer or the sniper just spend the entire game not fighting and just hiding, they've got you a victory point.
Yeah.
Cool. Before we go any further, we do need to rank that one. So, sectors is definitely one that I would choose to play.
Yeah, it's probably my second, third, fourth. It's totally up there in terms of a really good fun mission. I like seeing it at events. You often do see it, and it's good. It's a nice one.
Yeah, generally the rule of thumb for tournaments is if someone says they're doing a 1-day, 3-game, like a single day, 3-game event, you tend to see 1 kill points, 1 objectives, 1 movement. And so it tends to be meeting engagement, key positions, and sectors, or double envelopment.
Or no man's land instead of meeting engagement. Yeah.
Well, what I was about to say is sometimes you'll see no man's land. If you do double envelopment, you'll usually see that paired with no man's land, so at least one mission has a prep bombardment.
Yeah, and I was going to say that on the flip side, if you see no man's land and sectors, and it's a three-game 1-day event, that's 2 missions where you've got prep bombardment. And if you're playing against British where they can roll twice, then you can absolutely have a bad time.
So just before we move on, the prep bombardment, I definitely agree that less than half the missions at any tournament should have prep bombardment, because it is a huge advantage for the Brits who don't need that advantage. And also, as a player, as someone who's played Brits, I don't want to win the game before the game begins. I haven't turned up to a tournament to just basically play a game of who can roll the highest dice, because I could play that with a 3-year-old. That's not why I'm playing Bolt Action, and so I'm really not a fan of too much prep bombardment. I think the place where it's good is in attacker-defender, thematic missions. It's not good in sectors, no man's land. I find if it swings the game, it usually isn't a good game.
What you often see, which I do like, is rather than rolling separately for prep bombardment, one player rolls and either you both get it or you both don't get it.
Strong agree, yeah. Absolutely. That is, I think if you are going to put prep in to your tournament, have that rule so that you might end up with one person losing 2 units and the person didn't, but at least it's not 2 units and everyone's pinned, but you're not pinned at all, because that's really going to put you on the back foot. And as I say, when that goes in my favour, I dislike it as much as when it goes against me, because I want to play a fair game. Like I've come to try and try out this. I've got this mad strategy I want to try out, but then I didn't get to try the strategy because the game was won before the game started.
Yeah.
So on that note, the poll, we'll go through what people voted for. As we said, key positions was the most popular. 49% of people thought that was the best mission in the book. The next best was sectors. 22% of people thought that was the best. After that, meet and engagement, 9%. So actually, those 3 would be a really nice 1-day pack. Double envelopment, 6% after that.
Yeah.
The rest of them are sort of 1s and 2s, apart from, surprisingly, demolition. Demolition got 5%. So I think people are enjoying it from the thematic point of view, I would presume. And the fun of, you can make those objectives, and it does say this in the rule book, to make the objective something thematic like a fuel dump or something that you would want to destroy. And I think that's probably why people like that one.
Yeah.
Any surprises?
No surprises. I am shaking my head at Demolition. Obviously, you can't see that because it's a podcast rather than a video. But I do get it. I do see why people enjoy playing it. It's just not for me. Just a couple of points, Johnny, just on that note. Obviously, we've gone through the main rulebook missions, but there are other ones out there. And I would strongly recommend that people have a look at the Bolt Action Alliance missions, and also the Jugger missions as well. Because if you go to events and all you see are the same missions turning up, which is chosen from the Bolt Action main rulebook, it can get a bit boring and repetitive. So things like the Bolt Action Alliance missions, stuff like Nuts and Heartbreak Ridge and Timely Objectives, you often see them, especially on 2-day events. And also the Jugger Pack as well have their own missions. And Johnny, you've written your own missions, which you've used at events that you've TO'd at. So
yeah, there's a wealth of missions out there. What's really nice is there are a lot of people writing missions out there, myself included, as you say. I do think before you put them in a tournament pack, you should definitely play test them, because quite often they're not built for sort of tournament play for similar reasons, like if confused fights in play or something like that. Random effects like Kitty Hawk Down, where the plane just randomly lands somewhere, can sometimes be a bizarre one, especially if you've got a really slow force. So I would definitely tell people in advance if I'm putting that one in.
The other thing I was going to say is for TOs out there is to have a think about obviously the missions you're selecting, and also the amount of time you've got. If you've only got 2 hours per game, for example, 1,000 points, 2 hours per game, and you put in 2 missions that are deployment out the bag, you're spending 20, 30 minutes of admin time just setting up before turn 1. So if your tournament or event is set up so you actually don't have very long to play, you want to do first wave, because you want to get going as soon as you can. And like we were saying about prep bombardment is, don't include, where possible, don't include 2 missions that are prep bombardment out of a three mission day, because someone turns up with the Brits and potentially their opponent's going to have a bad day.
Oh, one of the things that I've seen at the Welsh Open is slight amendment to the pack, where because the dice out the bag can take a while, what happened at the Welsh Open last year is one side set up.
Yes.
So every mission had an attacker and a defender, even if it wasn't an attacker-defender mission, and the defender always set up first.
Yeah.
And then it just meant they just threw their army down, and then the attacker then put their army down, and it was much quicker. It did take a little bit away, and I know some people didn't like that because it took away that element of the game where you're sort of deploying and counter-deploying, but it did speed up the deployment. Yeah. So it is one that I quite like. I do think all these missions that you were just talking about there, we will have to do an episode in the future of our favourite custom missions not in the rulebook.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I certainly have thoughts about the ones that I like.
Of course you do.
And the ones that I've tried, and I think these could be brilliant if we just do one slight amendment.
Yeah.
But I've got nothing further to add on rulebook missions. What about you, Phil?
No, nothing further from me. Just to say thank you to everybody who did put my teeth back in, who did take part in the poll, and those who also commented as well and messaged us directly. Thanks for that. Echoing
that, huge thanks to everyone for listening, for commenting, for if you've left a review, thank you hugely.
Yeah, like, share, subscribe, and ta-ta for now as well. Cheers.
Ta-ta for now.